Long before the arrival of Christianity on African soil, the continent was already a sacred landscape, a world alive with spiritual wisdom, divine forces, and ancient traditions that governed every aspect of life. From the sacred waters of the Nile to the dense rainforests of West Africa, from the towering mountains of East Africa to the vast deserts of the Sahara, African spirituality was not just a set of beliefs, it was a way of being. It was a world where gods and goddesses walked beside mortals, where ancestors were not lost but living guides, and where the land itself was considered sacred, its trees, rivers, and mountains regarded as living beings. Yet, despite this profound spiritual heritage, African spirituality is often misunderstood, misrepresented, or dismissed. The arrival of Christianity and Islam, followed by centuries of colonial domination, led to a systematic suppression of indigenous beliefs. Missionaries labeled African gods as idols, dismissed ancestral veneration as ancestor worship, and declared sacred rituals to be pagan practices. Over time, many Africans were taught to see their own spiritual heritage as primitive, even as the world ignored the sophisticated moral philosophies, complex cosmologies, and sacred sciences that had guided African societies for millennia. But this narrative is not only false, it is an erasure of the continent's spiritual soul. African spirituality is far more than the exotic masks, colorful dances, or ritual chants often seen in popular media. It is a complex system of divine principles, ethical laws, and sacred traditions that touch every aspect of life: birth, initiation, marriage, death, and the afterlife. It is a worldview that recognizes the interconnectedness of all things, the sacredness of nature, and the continuous dialogue between the living and the dead. It is a living faith that honors not only gods but also ancestors, spirits, and sacred forces, each with its own role in the cosmic order. It is a spirituality that offers not just worship but wisdom, a guide for ethical living, communal harmony, and inner peace. In this journey, we will explore the true spiritual heritage of Africa before Christianity. We will visit the grand temples of ancient Egypt, where gods like Ra, Isis, and Osiris ruled over cosmic order. We will witness the power of the Orisha in West Africa, where deities like Ogun, Hun, and Sango guide the living with divine wisdom. We will stand beneath the sacred mountains of East Africa, where the Kikuyu venerated Ngai and the Zulu honored Unkulunkulu. And we will discover the sacred rituals, ancestral shrines, moral laws, and spiritual philosophies that defined African life for centuries. This is not a story of lost religions. It is the story of a living heritage, a sacred wisdom that endures. Across the vast expanse of Africa, long before the arrival of Christianity, the continent was a world alive with divine forces, sacred beings, and spiritual wisdom. Each region had its own pantheon of gods and goddesses, spirits, and sacred forces, beings who governed the natural world, protected human communities, and maintained the delicate balance of existence. These divine beings were not distant or abstract. They were present in the earth beneath one's feet. The rivers that flowed through villages, the mountains that touched the sky, and the stars that watched over the night. To understand what Africans believed before Christianity, we must first meet these divine forces and discover the sacred stories that gave them life. In the ancient lands of North Africa, along the fertile banks of the Nile River, the Egyptian Pantheon stood as one of the most sophisticated and enduring spiritual systems in history. At its center was Ra, the sun god, who sailed across the sky each day, bringing light and life to the world. Ra was not only the sun, he was the supreme creator, the source of all existence. Each sunrise was his daily triumph over darkness, a reminder of the cosmic order he maintained. But Ra was not alone. He was joined by the divine family of Osiris, Isis, and Horus, gods who embodied the cycle of life, death, and resurrection. Osiris was the god of the afterlife, ruling over the land of the dead with justice and mercy. His wife, Isis, was the goddess of magic, motherhood, and protection, while their son Horus, the falcon-headed god, represented kingship and divine power. Together, they told the sacred story of death conquered by love, of life renewed through divine grace. Central to the Egyptian spiritual world was Ma'at, the goddess of truth, justice, and cosmic balance. Ma'at was not just a deity, she was a principle, a divine law that governed both the gods and humans. In the afterlife, the hearts of the dead were weighed against her feather of truth. A heart that was light and free of sin could enter the paradise of Aru, while a heart heavy with wrongdoing was devoured by the monstrous Ammit. Ma'at was the order that held the universe together, the unseen law that ensured harmony in the heavens and justice on earth. And above all these gods was Amun, the hidden force, who became Amun-Ra in Thebes, uniting the power of the sun with the mystery of the unseen. Worshipped in grand temples, Amun-Ra was both the creator and the invisible spirit that moved through all things. Moving to West Africa, we encounter the powerful pantheon of the Yoruba people, known as the Orisha. At the highest point of this spiritual hierarchy is Olodumare, the supreme creator, distant and all-knowing, who governs the universe but is beyond direct human contact. To communicate with Olodumare, humanity turns to the Orisha, divine intermediaries who govern different aspects of life. Among them is Orunmila, the god of wisdom, divination, and destiny, whose sacred system of Ifa divination is a complex and sacred method of revealing divine will. Ogun, the god of iron, war, and craftsmanship, embodies strength and resilience, a deity who opens paths and breaks obstacles. Osun, the goddess of rivers, fertility, and love, is both gentle and powerful, a nurturing force who blesses women with children and soothes troubled souls. Sango, the god of thunder, lightning, and power, is a fierce warrior spirit whose thunderous voice shakes the heavens. These Orisha are not distant. They are actively involved in the lives of their devotees, who offer sacrifices, dance in sacred festivals, and speak their names in prayers. Beyond the Yoruba, the Akan people of Ghana venerate Name, the supreme sky god, alongside Asase Ya, the earth goddess who nurtures all living things. Trickster spirits like Anansi, the clever spider, teach lessons about wisdom and cunning through their mischievous stories. The Akan Pantheon is a world of cosmic balance, where the sky and earth, wisdom and cunning, life and death, all dance together in sacred harmony. In Central Africa, the Bakongo people honor Nzambi Mpungu, the supreme creator, a force both omnipotent and ever-present. Central to Bakongo spirituality is the concept of the Kalunga line, a spiritual boundary that separates the world of the living from the world of the dead. This line is not a barrier, it is a bridge, a sacred threshold where spirits travel and where the living can communicate with their ancestors. Nkisi, spiritual vessels filled with sacred herbs, shells, and bones, are used as instruments of healing and protection. These Nkisi are not mere objects, they are sacred contracts, physical symbols of divine power that connect the human world to the spiritual realm. In East Africa, among the Kikuyu of Kenya, Ngai is the supreme god who dwells on the sacred heights of Mount Kenya. Ngai is the god of creation, the giver of rain, and the source of all life. His voice is heard in the thunder, his blessings are felt in the fertile earth, and his presence is honored in the sacred groves where offerings are made. For the Nilotic peoples, such as the Luo and the Dinka, the divine spirit known as Joke is not a single being, but a sacred force present in all things, trees, rivers, animals, and humans. The Bukusu people of Kenya honor their ancestors, seeing them as guardians and spiritual guides who bridge the worlds of the living and the dead. In southern Africa, the Zulu people recognize Unkulunkulu, the great ancestor, the first human, and the creator of all humanity. From him came all human beings, and his spirit remains present in the sacred mountains and rivers of the land. Namkubulwan, the goddess of rain, fertility, and nature, is also venerated, her blessings sought in times of drought and harvest. Sacred mountains such as Table Mountain in the Cape and the Drakensberg Mountains are not just geographical landmarks, they are spiritual pillars, homes of the gods, and places of divine revelation. In the spiritual worldview of pre-Christian Africa, the dead were never truly gone. They were not erased from existence, nor were they forgotten. Instead, they became ancestors, powerful, guiding spirits who continued to watch over the living, offering protection, wisdom, and moral judgment. The concept of ancestor veneration was not simply a belief. It was a sacred relationship, a bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the spirit. Ancestors were not distant ghosts, they were family, living on in memory, in sacred rituals, and in the very land where they had once walked. To the African mind, life was a cycle, a sacred journey that did not end with death but transformed. Those who lived righteous lives, who upheld the sacred laws of the community, who honored their family and served their people, did not simply vanish at death. They became ancestral spirits, maintaining a spiritual presence that was both comforting and awe-inspiring. These ancestors were guides, offering wisdom in dreams, protection in times of danger, and judgment in moments of moral crisis. They were the silent witnesses who saw the deeds of the living, the guardians who stood at the boundary between order and chaos. In West Africa, this sacred relationship with the ancestors was a foundational aspect of spiritual life. Among the Igbo people of Nigeria, ancestors were honored through the maintenance of ancestral shrines, known as Obi or Opesi. These shrines were not just places of prayer. They were sacred spaces where the spirits of the departed were invited to dwell, watching over their descendants and blessing them. Offerings of food, kola nuts, and palm wine were placed at these shrines, accompanied by prayers and libations poured onto the earth. The Igbo believed that the spirits of the dead could reincarnate within the family, returning as newborn children who bore the traits of those who had come before. A child born with a distinctive mark or a unique talent was often believed to be an ancestor reborn, a sacred continuation of the family's spiritual lineage. Among the Akan people of Ghana, the ancestors were known as Nananom Nsimanfo, the revered spiritual forebears who maintained a sacred presence within the family. Every Akan family had an ancestral stool, a sacred object representing the spiritual essence of the ancestors, kept in a special room or shrine. During rituals, libations were poured and sacred prayers were offered to the ancestors, asking for their blessings, guidance, and protection. The Akan believed that the ancestors could intervene in the affairs of the living, protecting them from misfortune and ensuring the prosperity of the family. But they could also punish wrongdoing, bringing illness, bad luck, or even death to those who violated sacred laws. The Yoruba people of Nigeria expressed their ancestral reverence through the vibrant and sacred tradition of Egungun, a masquerade ceremony that brought the spirits of the ancestors to life. During Egungun festivals, masked dancers would appear, embodying the spirits of the departed, performing sacred dances and delivering messages to the community. These masked figures were not just performers. They were believed to be the actual spirits of the ancestors, who had come to advise, bless, or even chastise the living. Offerings were made, songs were sung, and the community gathered to honor those who had passed, but were never truly gone. In Central and East Africa, the concept of ancestors was also deeply ingrained in spiritual life. Among the Bakongo people, the boundary between the living and the dead was marked by the Kalunga line, a sacred boundary that separated the world of the living from the world of the ancestors. This line was not a barrier but a bridge, a pathway that the spirits could cross to offer guidance or protection. The Bakongo honored their ancestors through sacred nkisi, spiritual vessels filled with herbs, bones, shells, and other sacred objects. These nkisi were more than ritual tools. They were contracts with the ancestors, sacred symbols of their continued presence and power. In the Great Lakes region, including the lands of the Kikuyu and Luo, ancestral spirits were also seen as guardians and guides. Among the Bukusu of Kenya, the ancestors were honored in sacred groves, where rituals were performed to maintain the connection between the living and the dead. Elders, who were seen as living ancestors, carried the sacred wisdom of the community, preserving the stories and laws passed down by those who had come before. Ancestral veneration in Africa was not just a private belief, it was a communal practice, a sacred responsibility maintained through rituals and sacred spaces. Libation rituals were one of the most common ways of honoring the ancestors. In these ceremonies, water, palm wine, or alcohol was poured onto the earth as an offering, accompanied by prayers and invocations. These libations were not just symbolic, they were a direct communication with the spirits, a way of feeding them, refreshing them, and keeping them close. Sacred spaces were also essential to this relationship. Family altars, ancestral groves, and burial grounds were all considered sacred places where the presence of the ancestors was strongest. These were not places of fear, but of reverence, where the living could speak to their forebears, seek their blessings, and ask for forgiveness. Ancestral masks, totems, and sacred objects were also used to maintain this connection. Each one a vessel of spiritual power, a reminder that the dead were never truly gone. For the African, life was not a straight line, it was a sacred circle. The dead became ancestors, the ancestors watched over the living, and the living honored the ancestors, ensuring that their names and their wisdom were never forgotten. Life was a sacred journey, guided by divine principles, ancestral wisdom, and sacred rituals that marked every stage of existence. These rituals were not mere customs. They were sacred acts that connected the human world with the divine, ensuring that life remained in harmony with the unseen forces that governed the universe. From birth to death, from healing to protection, African spiritual practices were deeply symbolic, each one a sacred dialogue between humanity and the divine. One of the most profound expressions of African spirituality was found in the art of divination, a sacred practice that allowed individuals to seek divine guidance, uncover hidden truths, and understand their destinies. Among the Yoruba of West Africa, Ifa divination was a sacred science, a method of communication with the divine wisdom of Orunmila, the god of wisdom and destiny. This practice was conducted by a priest known as a Babalawo, or father of secrets, who would cast cowrie shells or palm nuts onto a sacred tray marked with spiritual symbols. The patterns formed by these shells were not random. They were messages from the divine, a sacred code that only the Babalawo could interpret. Through Ifa, seekers could learn of their destinies, find solutions to problems, and receive spiritual counsel. In southern Africa, divination took on a different form among the Sangoma, the traditional healers and spiritual guides of the Zulu, Xhosa, and other Bantu-speaking peoples. The Sangoma practiced bone divination, a sacred method in which animal bones, shells, coins, and other sacred objects were cast onto a mat. Each bone held a specific meaning, and their arrangement revealed the hidden truths of the spirit world. The Sangoma did not simply read the bones, they communed with the ancestral spirits who guided their hands and whispered truths through sacred visions. Bone divination was not just a ritual, it was a dialogue with the ancestors, a way of maintaining the sacred link between the living and the dead. Further north, in the deserts of Libya, another form of divination flourished, sand reading. Here, the diviner would draw sacred symbols in the sand, interpreting the lines, shapes, and patterns as messages from the spirit world. This ancient practice was a testament to the African belief that the earth itself was a sacred medium, a living canvas through which the divine could speak. Whether through shells, bones, or sand, divination was not just a way of telling the future. It was a sacred science, a method of listening to the voice of the divine. But spirituality in Africa was not confined to quiet rituals. It was a living, vibrant force expressed through sacred dance and music, which served as a bridge between the human and spiritual worlds. Drumming was a sacred art, a language of rhythm that called forth the gods, summoned ancestral spirits, and stirred the soul. Each beat, each pattern was more than music, it was a prayer, a conversation with the divine. In West Africa, the Egungun masquerade of the Yoruba transformed dance into a sacred performance, where masked dancers embodied the spirits of the ancestors, moving with a power that was both mesmerizing and divine. In Central and East Africa, the Ngoma dance was a sacred ritual, a dance of healing and spiritual empowerment, where the rhythm of the drums was believed to drive out evil spirits and restore harmony to the soul. Chants and sacred songs accompanied these dances, invocations to the gods, and prayers that called forth divine blessings. These were not mere performances. They were acts of faith, spiritual ceremonies that brought communities together and bridged the gap between the seen and the unseen. African spirituality was also defined by sacred rituals that marked the stages of life. At birth, newborns were welcomed into the world through sacred naming ceremonies, where the child's name was chosen not only for its meaning, but for its spiritual power. Among the Yoruba, the Ileki ceremony marked a child's connection to the Orisha, who would guide them. In the Akan tradition, the outdooring ceremony introduced the child to the community, a sacred blessing that ensured the protection of the ancestors. Initiation rites marked the transition from childhood to adulthood, a sacred journey of transformation where young boys and girls learned the sacred secrets of their people. These rites varied across Africa. Among the Xhosa of southern Africa, boys underwent the sacred rite of Bulwaluko, a journey of endurance and spiritual awakening. In West Africa, young girls participated in the Dipo initiation of the Krobo, a ritual of purification, sacred dance, and wisdom. Marriage was also a sacred union, not just between two individuals but between two families, two ancestral lineages. Sacred oaths were exchanged, libations were poured in honor of the ancestors, and the couple was blessed by the elders. The Igbo performed the Igbanukwu, the traditional wine-carrying ceremony, where the bride presented palm wine to her groom as a symbol of acceptance and love. In the Akan tradition, the Kuko ceremony marked the sacred union with prayers, songs, and ancestral blessings. Even in death, the sacred journey continued. Funerary rituals were more than a farewell. They were sacred passages, ensuring that the spirit of the departed found peace among the ancestors. The Ashanti celebrated the final funeral rites, Doti, a sacred gathering where the deceased was honored with drumming, dance, and sacred songs. The Yoruba performed Itutu, a ritual cleansing of the deceased spirit, ensuring that it entered the ancestral realm in peace. But African spirituality was not only about sacred celebrations, it was also a source of healing and protection. Herbal medicine was a sacred science passed down through generations, where sacred herbs, roots, and barks were used to heal the body and restore the spirit. The Babalawo of the Yoruba, the Sangoma of southern Africa, and the Nganga of the Bakongo were not just healers. They were spiritual physicians who combined natural medicine with sacred prayers and invocations. Amulets and charms were also used for protection, sacred objects imbued with spiritual power. Among the Bakongo, sacred Nkisi figures were used as protective vessels, filled with sacred herbs and empowered by ancestral spirits. The Igbo created Ichi marks, sacred facial scarifications that protected the wearer and connected them to their ancestral lineage. Africa was not just a land of gods and spirits. It was a continent guided by sacred laws and moral philosophies. A world where ethics were not merely rules but sacred principles, woven into the fabric of life. These principles were not enforced by human governments alone. They were upheld by the divine, by the ancestors, and by the cosmic order itself. They were the heartbeat of African spirituality, shaping not only how people worshipped, but how they lived, how they treated one another, and how they understood the world. In ancient Egypt, the foundation of moral life was the sacred principle of Ma'at. Ma'at was more than a goddess. She was the embodiment of truth, justice, and cosmic order. Her symbol was the feather, light and pure, and it was against this feather that the hearts of the dead were weighed in the hall of judgment. A heart that was free of sin, that had lived a life of honesty, kindness, and righteousness, would be as light as the feather of Ma'at, allowing the soul to enter the paradise of Aru. But a heart heavy with falsehood, greed, or cruelty would be devoured by the monstrous Ammit, the devourer of souls. This was not just a myth. It was a sacred truth that governed Egyptian society. Ma'at was not just a spiritual ideal. She was a way of life, a reminder that every action had consequences, that justice was divine, and that the universe was held together by truth. Moving west to the forests of Nigeria, the Yoruba people lived by a sacred moral principle known as Iwa Pele, which translates to good character. For the Yoruba, spirituality was not just about rituals and offerings. It was about living a life of kindness, humility, patience, and honesty. Iwa Pele was a sacred commitment to ethical living, a recognition that the gods favored those who were just, compassionate, and true. The Orisha, the divine forces who guided the Yoruba, were not merely powerful beings, they were moral exemplars, and to please them, one had to cultivate good character. A person with Iwa Pele was not only respected in the community, they were blessed by the gods, protected by the ancestors, and guided by divine wisdom. In southern Africa, the principle of Ubuntu captured the essence of African ethics. Ubuntu is often translated as "I am because we are," but it is far more than a slogan. It is a philosophy of communal harmony, a recognition that human beings are interconnected, that the well-being of one is tied to the well-being of all. Ubuntu taught that kindness, generosity, and forgiveness were not just personal virtues, they were sacred duties. To harm another was to harm oneself, and to help another was to strengthen the community. In societies guided by Ubuntu, disputes were not simply punished. They were resolved through reconciliation, with elders acting as mediators, ensuring that peace was restored and that broken bonds were healed. In Igbo land, the concept of Omenala represented the sacred laws and customs that governed community life. Omenala was not just a set of rules, it was a sacred tradition, a body of wisdom passed down through generations, defining everything from marriage customs to land rights, from inheritance laws to the resolution of disputes. To break Omenala was not simply to commit crime, it was to violate the sacred order of the community, an act that could bring misfortune, illness, or spiritual wrath. But Omenala was also flexible, interpreted and applied by councils of elders who maintained the sacred balance of justice and mercy. African justice systems were not blind. They were guided by spiritual wisdom, by the voices of the ancestors, and by divine guidance. Disputes were not simply settled through punishment, but through spiritual mediation, where elders, priests, or diviners acted as sacred judges. In the Yoruba tradition, the Ifa oracle could be consulted to reveal the spiritual cause of conflict and the path to resolution. Among the Bakongo, disputes could be settled through Nkisi, sacred objects that embodied spiritual power, where oaths were sworn and truth was revealed. The Ashanti used sacred stools, which represented ancestral authority, to judge serious crimes, while in the Great Lakes region, sacred groves were used as places of judgment, where the spirits of the ancestors were believed to watch over the proceedings. African ethics were not abstract. They were practical, lived principles that defined how people treated one another, how they respected the earth, and how they honored the gods. They were a reminder that morality was not a human invention. It was a sacred law, a divine commandment woven into the fabric of creation. Whether it was the truth of Ma'at, the kindness of Iwa Pele, the harmony of Ubuntu, or the sacred customs of Omenala, these principles were more than words. They were sacred paths, guiding African societies with wisdom, justice, and grace. One of the most profound expressions of this sacred relationship with nature was found in the sacred groves, protected spaces of forest that were considered the dwelling places of the gods, the ancestors, and the spirits of the land. Among the Igbo of Nigeria, these sacred groves were known as Ofia Allah, dedicated to Allah, the Earth Mother, who governed morality, fertility, and ancestral law. These groves were protected by strict taboos. No tree could be cut, no animal hunted, and no soil disturbed without permission from the spiritual guardians. To violate a sacred grove was not only an act of environmental destruction, it was a spiritual offense, an act of disrespect to the divine presence that dwelled within. In the Yoruba tradition, sacred forests were also central to spiritual life. These forests were the homes of the Orisha, the divine forces who guided the world. Priests and priestesses would enter these groves to perform rituals, offer sacrifices, and communicate with the gods. These were places of healing, prophecy, and purification, spaces where the human and spiritual worlds met. Sacred groves were not just ecological reserves, they were spiritual sanctuaries, places where the wisdom of the gods flowed like the wind through the trees. But the sacred was not confined to the forests. It rose above the earth, reaching toward the heavens in the form of sacred mountains. In East Africa, the towering heights of Mount Kenya were revered by the Kikuyu people, who believed that their supreme god, Ngai, dwelled at its summit. The mountain was not merely a geological formation, it was a sacred throne, a place where the prayers of the people rose like mist, reaching the ears of the divine. In the Great Rift Valley, the snow-capped peak of Mount Kilimanjaro, was also considered sacred, a silent witness to the prayers of the Chaga and Maasai peoples who lived beneath its shadow. To climb such mountains was not simply an adventure. It was a spiritual journey, a pilgrimage into the presence of the gods. In southern Africa, Table Mountain stood as a sacred landmark for the Khoisan people, a place of ancient power where ancestral spirits were believed to dwell. And in the Zulu kingdom, the Drakensberg Mountains were revered as a place of divine revelation, a sacred barrier that separated the human world from the spiritual realm. These mountains were not just physical structures. They were spiritual towers, natural temples that touched the sky and anchored the earth. But the sacred did not only rise to the heavens, it also flowed through the land in the form of sacred rivers. The Nile River in Egypt was not merely a source of life. It was the sacred vein of the gods, the lifeblood of the land, and the domain of Hapi, the god of the Nile's flood. Along its banks rose temples dedicated to Ra, Isis, Osiris, and Horus, where priests offered prayers and poured libations into the sacred waters. In West Africa, the Niger River was also considered sacred, a divine force that nourished the land, sustained kingdoms, and carried the prayers of the people. The Zambezi River in southern Africa was known as the River of Life, a sacred waterway where the Tonga people believed that the spirit of Nyami Nyami, the river god, dwelled. These sacred places were not merely beautiful landscapes, they were living altars, natural temples where humanity was reminded of its connection to the divine. Forest shrines, river altars, and mountain sanctuaries were places of pilgrimage, where offerings were made, prayers were spoken, and spiritual mysteries were revealed. In these places, priests and priestesses maintained the sacred flame, elders offered wisdom, and the community gathered to renew their bond with the gods, the ancestors, and the land itself. But African spirituality was not only about reverence, it was also about responsibility. The sacred nature of forests, mountains, and rivers was not just a spiritual belief, it was a call to environmental stewardship. To harm the land was to dishonor the gods who dwelled within it. Trees were not merely timber, they were sacred beings. Rivers were not simply water, they were sacred veins of life. Mountains were not just stone, they were the thrones of the divine. This sacred respect for nature was not a form of romantic idealism. It was a practical ethic, a recognition that life depended on maintaining harmony with the natural world. This sacred environmental ethic is what allowed African societies to maintain ecological balance for centuries, long before the rise of modern conservation. Sacred groves remained untouched, rivers were honored with prayers, and mountains were respected as sacred towers. The land was not conquered, it was worshipped. And this respect for nature was not just an ancient custom, it was a sacred truth, a recognition that the earth was not just a place to live, but a sacred temple, a living gift, a divine presence. In the forests, mountains, and rivers of Africa, the divine was not far away, it was always present, always watching, always blessing. The ancient spiritual beliefs of Africa are not relics of a forgotten past. They are living traditions that continue to inspire, guide, and empower millions of people today. Across the continent and throughout the global African diaspora, there is a powerful movement of cultural revival, a renewed appreciation for African spirituality that is reshaping how people understand their heritage and their identity. From the sacred Orisha of the Yoruba to the divine principles of Ma'at in ancient Egypt, from the wisdom of Ubuntu in southern Africa to the ancestral veneration of the Igbo, these ancient beliefs are being rediscovered, honored, and practiced in new and meaningful ways. This revival is not just a matter of cultural pride, it is also an affirmation of spiritual sovereignty, a recognition that African wisdom has always offered profound truths about life, morality, and the human soul. In a world where many people feel disconnected from tradition, African spirituality offers a path of healing and belonging. For those who have grown up hearing only foreign religions and colonial narratives, the rediscovery of African spirituality is a way of reconnecting with their roots, of reclaiming a sacred heritage that was never truly lost. But African spirituality is not only about identity. It is also a source of environmental ethics, a sacred understanding of nature that is more urgent now than ever. Long before the rise of environmental movements, African societies understood that the land was sacred. that forests, rivers, and mountains were not just resources but living temples. In a time of climate crisis and ecological destruction, the ancient African respect for nature offers a powerful reminder that humanity is part of the earth, not separate from it. Sacred groves, river shrines, and mountain sanctuaries are not just cultural symbols. They are living examples of ecological wisdom, a sacred call to protect the earth. Today, African spirituality is not just remembered, it is practiced. In Nigeria, devotees of Ifa gather to consult the sacred wisdom of Orunmila. In Ghana, Akan priests pour libations to the ancestors, maintaining a sacred link that has endured for centuries. In South Africa, Sangomas still cast sacred bones, offering healing and spiritual guidance to their communities. Across the diaspora, African Americans and Afro-Caribbeans have embraced the Orisha, the Vodou spirits, and the sacred rhythms of African drumming as paths of empowerment and cultural pride. This living spirituality is more than just a return to the past. It is a source of resilience, a sacred wisdom that has endured enslavement, colonialism, and cultural suppression. It is a reminder that African beliefs are not primitive, they are profound, that African gods are not forgotten, they are alive, and that African wisdom is not a thing of the past. It is a living force, a sacred truth that still speaks to the soul. African spirituality is not a forgotten past. It is a living heritage, a sacred wisdom that has endured the test of time. It is the whisper of the ancestors carried on the wind, the silent strength of sacred groves, the wisdom of elders who speak of cosmic laws, and the divine presence that flows through rivers, mountains, and forests. It is a reminder that the sacred is not distant. It is here, beneath your feet, above your head, and within your soul. To embrace African spirituality is to remember that you are never alone, that you are connected to the sacred earth, to your ancestors, and to a divine truth that has always been with you. And now, I speak a blessing over you. May the wisdom of the ancestors guide your thoughts. May the light of divine truth shine upon your path. May the sacred spirit of peace dwell in your heart, and may you walk in harmony with yourself, with others, and with the earth. May your life be blessed with clarity, your struggles met with strength, and your spirit uplifted with hope. If this journey has touched your soul, if it has sparked a light within you, do more than watch. Be a part of this Afrocosmos family. Like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to continue walking this path of truth and wisdom. This is not just a channel, it is a sacred circle, and you are welcome here.